In this crazy world, it's so hard to unwind. So I'm taking time just for me. Gonna find my peace, let my soul be free. In the quiet moments, that's where I'll find a little room to breathe, leave it all behind. Give me room to breathe, I need some time to heal my heart, to clear my mind. Gonna love myself, yeah, I believe in the power of me. Just give me room to breathe.
Great new day to all my self-care friends and family. Welcome back to another Room to Breathe podcast. I'm your host, Life Coach 614, and I am so happy that you've made space to be here with us today. Now, before we jump into today's episode, I need you to do me a quick favor. If you're feeling the vibe, go ahead and show us some love. Tap the screen, like, comment, but most importantly, I need for everyone to share this out with someone who could use a little healing energy today. And if this is your first time here, or you haven't done so already, go ahead and hit that follow button. Subscribe to our channel so that way you're always tapped in when a new episode drops. I also want to personally invite you to check out our digital home at theselfcareclub.org, where you will find everything you need from affirmative apparel to motivational merch, as well as a ton of free resources to help nourish your growth and remind you that you are supported every step of the way. Just know that you don't have to do this alone. We are healing in community, growing one breath, one moment, one day at a time. So today, I encourage you to give yourself permission to pause, reflect, and to make space for peace, for growth, but most importantly for you. And remember, if anything in today's episode hits home, be sure to drop a green heart in the chat. That is our community's way of saying I am healing, I am growing, and I am showing up for me. Now, let's get ready to breathe, reflect, and grow together. Like keyword being together, right? All right, family. So it is Wednesday. We had a couple days off. I decided to do like this last minute makeover of my office, and I thought I was going to get it all done yesterday, but I didn't. So we're in this like little awkward space, but hopefully the scene is coming together for you guys, and I'll be able to do a better reveal as we go forward. But anyways, y'all ain't come to hear all that. Y'all came to hear the word of the day. All right, it's Wednesday. And so on Wednesdays here, we like to share a new word into the community, just to give new meaning or new life to what we feel. And so today we are talking about a word that captures something that so many of us have felt, but didn't always have the language for. Okay, so let me go ahead and put this word in the chat so we are ready. If somebody could pin that for me on TikTok, it would be great. All right, y'all. So our word today, Exulansis. Exulansis. To me, it sounds like a very fancy way of saying excellences, right? Exulansis. Because, like, that's cute, right? Okay, let me just say it again. Exulansis. Exulansis. And let me just tell y'all the emphasis on that middle syllable, lan. So, exulansis. Y'all can't unhear that. Y'all do hear it, right? Excellences, like excellences. Okay, whatever. Anyways, listen, y'all. The origin of this word comes from a project called the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, where new words were created to describe emotional experiences that many people felt but rarely had the language for. Okay, welcome in, Z. And so Exulansis is one of those powerful words that were created to give meaning to what we feel. The meaning of Exulansis is the moment that you stop trying to explain an experience because you realize that the people around you simply cannot relate to it. It's that quiet resignation when you recognize that some parts of your life story are too layered, maybe too painful or too personal for people who haven't, walked a similar road to fully understanding. You can, yes, or you could do the plain one. So listen, with Exulansis, you recognize that there are parts of your story that the people around you just can't resonate with. And so instead of explaining yourself or your story over and over again, you just stop, right? You just stop because, it's not because your experience wasn't real. It's not because your healing isn't valid, but because you realize that some stories are only truly understood by the people who live them. And so today we're going to talk about what it looks like in real life, especially when it comes to our healing. Because sometimes I think that the most painful part of healing isn't, the trauma itself, because you survive, right? It's realizing that the people around you don't understand the version of you that survived it. They didn't see the breakdown. They didn't see the nights that you prayed yourself through. They didn't see the boundaries that you had to learn just to build this new version of you up, right? This version that needs to protect their peace. All they see is the version of you that's changed. And sometimes that version confuses them. But I want you guys to understand that confusion from others does not invalidate your growth. So today we're going to unpack this idea of exulansis together, right? That silence that sometimes follows healing, the loneliness that can come from growth, and the power of honoring your journey even when other people don't fully understand it. And again, remember guys, during this conversation, if anything resonates, go ahead and drop those green hearts. Those little green hearts around here mean something powerful, right? When you see those green hearts, it means I'm healing, I'm growing, and I'm finally showing up for me. All right. So let's get into this. When I was working on the word for today, I was like, you know what? I think that this is one of the words that we didn't know we needed. All right. Some emotions live inside of us for years before we actually, even have the language to describe them. Have you ever noticed that? Like you can, feel something deeply, but when you try to explain it, the words don't quite land the way the experience did. And so again, exulansis is one of those feelings. It's that quiet moment when you realize that explaining your experience to someone who has never lived anything close to it feels almost impossible. And it's not because you can't talk. It's not because you don't know your story, but because you start noticing something in the way that people respond when you try to. Coach Regina, welcome in. Maybe you open up about something painful and somebody quickly says, well, everything happens for a reason. Maybe you share a difficult chapter of your story and somebody replies with, well, at least you're stronger now. Or maybe you explain how something affected you and they look at you like you're overreacting. And little by little, you start realizing that they're hearing your words, but they're not actually understanding your experience. Because understanding, the experience requires empathy. Understanding requires imagination. Understanding requires the willingness to sit in somebody else's reality, even when it's uncomfortable. And the truth is, not everyone has developed that kind of emotional capacity yet. Some people can only process life through the lens of, what they've personally experienced. Shamika, welcome in. And so when your story doesn't match their reality, people tend to minimize it, right? They dismiss it. Or, they try to fix it quickly so that way they don't have to sit in the discomfort of it. And so that's when exulansis begins to show up, right? It's the moment that you stop explaining, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in this quiet recognition. Because you start to realize that explaining your trauma to someone who has never confronted their own pain is like trying to describe color to someone who refuses to open their eyes. At some point, you realize that the energy that it takes to keep explaining your life is exhausting. So instead of repeating yourself over and over again, you simply just start choosing peace. You start choosing silence. You start choosing discernment about who gets access to your story. And, I want to pause here for a moment because I think that this is so important. Choosing not to explain your experience anymore is not the same thing as suppressing your voice. There is a difference. Suppression is when you silence yourself out of fear. Exulansis is when you silence the explanation because you recognize that the audience isn't capable of understanding. And see, that is wisdom. That's emotional maturity. That is growth. Because, healing teaches you that not everyone deserves front row seats to your story. Some people only get the summary. Some people only get the healed version. And some people just don't get access at all, right? And it's not because you're hiding. It's simply because you've learned that your peace is more valuable than someone else's misunderstanding. Welcome in, Lady Blue. And, the moment that you accept that truth, things start to shift on the inside. You stop performing your pain for people who were never really listening to you in the first place. You stop over-explaining your boundaries. You stop defending your healing. And that space, the space where you no longer feel obligated to explain everything that you've survived, that is where, real freedom starts to grow. So let's talk about, when people only meet the healed version, right? I think that one of the most complicated parts of healing is this truth right here. That, most people only meet the healed version of you. See, they didn't meet the version of you that was struggling just to get through the day. They didn't meet the version of you that cried in the shower because that was the only place you felt safe enough to fall apart. They didn't meet the version of you that sat in your car before going into work, trying to gather the strength to pretend that everything was okay. They didn't meet that version of you that kept showing up for everybody else while secretly wondering if anybody would ever show up for you. And, all they met was this version of you that survived. They met the version of you that has started setting boundaries. The version of you that started saying no. The version of you that stopped tolerating the same behaviors that you used to tolerate. The version of you that started choosing peace over people pleasing. Elevated Awakenings, Monique, welcome in. And listen, because they never saw what you survived to become the person that you are, they sometimes misunderstand your healing. People are constantly saying things like you've changed. You used to be nicer. You used to be more available. You acting different. Y'all know we brand new, right? And here's the thing. I keep telling you guys, they're not wrong, right? You did change because healing requires change. So yeah, you did change. You can't heal and stay the same person who tolerated the harm. You cannot grow and keep, the same patterns that kept you stuck. You cannot protect your peace while still abandoning yourself to keep everybody else comfortable. Something had to shift. Something had to evolve. Something inside of you had to say enough, right? I have reached my max capacity. Enough. But Again, the people who, benefited from the old version of you, those are the ones that often struggle with the new version, because the old version of you was easier to access. That old version of you said yes when he or she really meant no. The old version of you overextended yourself just to keep the peace. The old version of you made yourself smaller so other people could remain comfortable. But see, this healed version of you has boundaries. This healed version of you asks questions. The healed version of you recognizes red flags sooner. The healed version no longer sacrifices their peace just to maintain proximity. And sometimes people interpret that shift as an attitude. But family, I hope you hear me when I say something that might hopefully free somebody listening right now. Boundaries often look like rejection to people who were used to your unlimited access. So when you stop overgiving, when you stop over-explaining and overextending yourself, some people feel that shift immediately. And instead of recognizing that you're just trying to protect your peace, they assume that you've grown cold. But the truth is, you didn't become cold. You're just gaining clarity. You're becoming clear about what you deserve, clear about what you will tolerate, clear about the kind of energy that you allow in your life. And clarity can be uncomfortable for people who were used to your confusion, because, confusion makes you a lot easier to control. Confusion makes it easier to manipulate you, easier to guilt you. But we know that healing brings clarity, and clarity brings boundaries, and boundaries bring distance from the very dynamics that once drained you. So yeah, some people only meet the healed version of you, and they may never understand the journey that it took for you to become her. But here's the part that I need you to remember. You did not heal to be understood. You healed to be free. I'm going to say that again. You did not heal to be understood. We did not come this far just for somebody else to understand us. We are healing to free ourselves. Thank you so much, Monique. Oh, thank you. Monique says, your podcast has helped me heal. Wait, your podcast has helped me out a lot. I really feel peace and I'm still healing, but I just want to thank you for your time and wisdom on life with others, life for others. Thank you. She's gonna have me all in my feels. Thank you, Monique. I also, you guys, want to talk about the cost of becoming her, right? Because healing costs us something. And so I want to, slow down for just a moment and honestly talk about something that I feel like people don't say enough when they're talking about healing. And that is that healing has a cost. And I'm not talking about like a financial cost. I'm focused on the personal cost. Because becoming the version of yourself that is healed, grounded, and self-aware requires us to let go of parts of our life that once felt familiar. And sometimes those parts that we let go are people. Sometimes they're habits. Sometimes they're environments. And sometimes they're versions of yourself that you had to release. Healing asks you to look at your life with honesty, not the filtered version, right? Not the version that you told other people, but that real version. And see, that kind of honesty can be uncomfortable because healing forces you to acknowledge things like the boundaries that you didn't set, the red flags that you ignored, The times you stayed longer than you should have because you hoped that things would change. The way you abandon your own needs just to keep relationships intact. And see, when you begin that process of self-reflection, things start shifting. You start growing. You start evolving. You start becoming more aware of your own patterns, your triggers, your wounds, and your worth, you know? Because see, growth has a ripple effect. When you change, your relationships start to change too. People who were comfortable with the old version of you may struggle to connect with the new version. And it's not because you're doing something wrong. It's because the version of you that they knew is no longer available in that same way. And that can be difficult to people, especially when those relationships once felt safe or familiar or even necessary. See, healing often asks you to sit in the reality that certain connections were built around survival patterns, right? Not mutual growth. We're talking about those trauma bonds. You know, maybe the relationship worked when you were the one who was always giving. Maybe it worked when you were the one who was always fixing a problem. Maybe it worked when you were the one who was always shrinking yourself so everybody else could remain comfortable. But when you actually begin healing, those dynamics stop working. And when they stop working, the relationship often starts to feel strained. And see, that's where Exulansis shows up again. Because when you try to explain your growth, some people won't understand it. You might say, hey, I'm working on my boundaries. And all they hear is, you're pushing me away. Welcome in. Short Circuit Robin, welcome in. You might say, I need to protect my peace. And all they hear is, you think you're better than me now, right? You might say, I'm choosing healthier patterns for my life. And they hear, you change too much. And see, that's when you start to realize that painful truth that not everyone is meant to grow with you. Yes. We are walking in our purpose around here. We welcome you in as well. And you know, think about it. Some people are connected to the version of you that existed before your healing began, right? And so when that version of you begins to evolve, the connection sometimes struggles to adapt. And I want to make sure that I'm saying this clearly because I don't want anybody to misunderstand. Elevated Awakening Brooks, welcome back, sis. Outgrowing someone doesn't mean that you stop loving them. Thank you. Outgrowing someone does not mean that you stop loving them. It doesn't mean that you stop wishing them well, right? It simply means that your life is moving in a direction that requires different energy, different boundaries, and sometimes a different proximity. Y'all know I say it all the time. It's like, I don't have any ill will towards people. It's like, I want you to eat, right? I want to see you succeed. I want you to do well. So I want you to eat, but I can no longer serve you from this table, right? It means that I'm growing, right? My life is evolving and I'm, moving in a direction that requires different energy, different boundaries. And we have to be okay with that because growth changes proximity. Healing changes access. And, becoming the version of yourself that honors your peace often requires letting go of versions of yourself that tolerated chaos and drama and noise, right? And see, that process is not easy. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you. Never once have you heard me tell you guys that healing is easy, right? Right, pretty girl? But I have said that healing is necessary because becoming her, right? The healed, self-aware, grounded version of you requires courage. It requires honesty. It requires letting go of the life that once felt normal in order to build the life that actually feels healthy. And the truth is, the cost of healing is real, but the cost of staying the same is even greater. She said one more time for the ones in the back. Listen, I'm serious though. It really requires you to be honest with yourself. And there's a period in the healing journey where our silence can become self-protection. It's where you start realizing that not every conversation around you deserves your energy. That not every misunderstanding deserves your explanation. Not every single person deserves access to the deepest parts of your story. Early in healing, many of us feel the need to explain everything, right? We think that we need to explain why we changed, why we set our boundaries, right? We explain why we walked away, why this relationship or friendship or companionship has ended. We explain why we're no longer available the way we used to be. And if you're anything like me, you might have even tried to explain the most gentle, loving way possible, hoping that people would understand you. Monique said, that's me, right? Because what we be out here trying to soften the message. We try to choose the right words, right? We try to make our healing feel palatable so everybody can enjoy it. But at some point, you start to realize that understanding cannot be forced. No matter how clearly you explain your boundaries, no matter how calmly you speak your truth, no matter how respectfully you communicate your needs, some people will still just misunderstand you. And see, that's when our healing starts to teach us discernment, right? Discernment is the ability to recognize who is capable of receiving your truth and who isn't. Because explaining yourself to someone who's committed to misunderstanding you will drain your spirit every time. Exactly, Brooks. Exactly. So again, you have to understand that some people aren't even listening to understand you, right? They're simply listening to respond. They're listening to defend themselves. Thank you, Tania. They are listening to find a moment where they can turn your healing into a personal attack, right? Because people like to weaponize what you've gone through. They like to throw your words back at you. And so once you recognize that pattern, you stop explaining so much. You stop trying to convince people of your growth. You stop trying to make everybody comfortable with your boundaries. And instead, you just start choosing silence. Now, let me be clear about something. I'm not talking about the kind of silence. This kind of silence is not passive, right? This type of silence is intentional. It's the type of silence that says, I don't need to prove my healing to anybody. It's the silence that says my peace is more important than winning this argument. It's the silence that says, if you truly care about understanding me, you'll listen. And if you don't, then no amount of explaining is going to change that. And see, family, this kind of silence can feel unfamiliar at first. Especially, to those of you who grew up in environments where you had to constantly explain yourself just to be heard. Maybe you had to justify your feelings. Maybe you grew up defending your boundaries. Thank you, butterfly. Maybe you had to over communicate just to avoid conflict. So, when healing starts to teach you that you don't have to explain everything anymore, it can feel strange. But over time, you begin to notice that silence can protect your peace. Silence can protect your energy. Silence can protect the sacred parts of your healing that don't belong in every conversation. Because not every space is safe enough for your truth. Not every person has the emotional maturity to hold your story with care. And once you accept that reality, you start becoming more intentional about where your vulnerability goes. You begin asking questions like, is this person capable of hearing me? Is this conversation rooted in curiosity or control? Am I explaining myself to be understood, or am I explaining myself because I feel pressured to defend my healing? And see, when that answer becomes clear, you start honoring it. Sometimes that means stepping back. Sometimes it means redirecting conversations. Sometimes it means choosing silence and letting your boundaries speak for themselves. And the truth is, your healing doesn't need constant explanation. Your growth doesn't require anyone's approval. And your peace should never depend on how well someone else understands your journey. Silence in this season is not weakness. It is wisdom. It's self-respect. It's the quiet strength of someone who has finally learned that protecting their peace is not selfish, that it is necessary, right? And so then we start to shift into this healing without validation. And I want to talk about this because I think that so many people discover, this during their healing journey, but nobody really prepares for it, right? Sometimes your healing will not be validated by the people you expected it from. When you finally say, hey, I'm choosing me, I want to better myself, I want to work on myself, I want to heal, you immediately in your mind think of people who are going to be on the team and they're going to root for you and they're going to encourage you, right? Because when we go through something difficult, there's this natural part of us that wants somebody to say, I see what you went through. I understand why that hurt you. You didn't deserve that. Those words feel soothing to the open wound. Validation reminds us that our experience was real, that our pain mattered, that, we weren't just imagining things. But the truth is, not everybody will be able to offer you that kind of validation. Sometimes the very people who witnessed your pain are the people who deny it. Sometimes the people who hurt you are unwilling to acknowledge the damage that they've caused. Sometimes the people around you, minimize your experience because accepting it will require them to confront their own behavior. Yes, they deny it and add to it. And sometimes the silence that you receive from others becomes louder than any apology that you were hoping for. And see, that's when healing reaches a critical moment, because that's the point where you have a choice to make. You can continue waiting for that external validation that may never come, or you can begin validating yourself. Now, I know it might sound simple, but this is actually one of the hardest parts of healing, right? Because so many of us were raised in environments where our emotions were dismissed. Maybe you were told things like you're too sensitive, you're overreacting, just get over it, right? So you learn to question your own feelings. You learn to doubt your own perception of what happened. You learn to shrink your pain so it would, wouldn't make other people uncomfortable. But healing asks you to rebuild with, rebuild trust with yourself. It asks you to look at your story honestly and say, what I experienced mattered. How it affected me was real. My feelings deserve acknowledgement, even if nobody else offers it. That kind of self-validation becomes a turning point, because when you stop outsourcing your healing for other people's approval, your healing becomes stronger, more grounded, more resilient. You stop needing someone else to confirm what you already know in your spirit. You stop chasing apologies from people who are incapable of giving them. You stop waiting for someone to finally understand the depth of your experience. Instead, you just begin, to give yourself the compassion that you may have been missing before. You become the voice that says, I believe you. I honor what you went through. I'm proud of you for surviving. And see, I want to say something again that I hope helps release somebody from burden today. Closure does not always come from the person who hurt you. I'm going to say that again. Closure does not always come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes closure comes from the moment that you decide that your healing will move forward with or without their acknowledgement. That's when your healing stops depending on someone else, right? Somebody else's growth. And it starts standing firmly on your own. Because true healing doesn't require everyone to agree with your story. It simply requires you to stop denying your story. Your healing no longer waits for validation. It becomes its own validation. The peace you feel, the boundaries that you hold, the clarity you walk in, those things become evidence that your healing is real, even if someone never recognizes it, even if some people never understand it, even if some people never admit what happened. Your healing is still valid. Your growth is still real. Your peace is still worth protecting. Monique said that was one of the hardest parts for me, and learning to let go. Honestly, Monique, I think that that's one of the hardest parts for many of us. There's a certain level of loneliness that comes with growth. And let's just go ahead and, talk honestly about something that, again, many people experience during healing, but we don't always feel comfortable admitting it, right? We don't always feel safe enough to admit this. But, again, growth can feel lonely. And it's not because you're doing something wrong, not because you're isolated, right? It's because when you start changing internally, your external world also starts to shift. And that feels a bit unfamiliar, right? You might start noticing, certain conversations no longer interest you the way they used to. You might start noticing that environments you once felt comfortable in now drain you. You might even start noticing that some relationships begin to feel a little misaligned. Not toxic necessarily, right? Just different. It's not that you've done something wrong or they've done something wrong. It's just different now. The version of you that once tolerated certain patterns is no longer the same version of you that exists today. And that's simply because healing changes your awareness, right? You start realizing things that you overlooked before. You start noticing red flags earlier. You start noticing how people treat you, how they speak to you, how they show up or don't show up in your life. And once your awareness expands, it's hard to go back to pretending you didn't see what now, you clearly understand. That awareness can create a distance. And it's not always a physical distance. Sometimes it's an emotional distance or an energetic distance. Sometimes just the quiet realization that you're not walking the same path that you once did together. And that's when people say, all those things about, you've changed. But again, they're right. You have changed. Because growth is supposed to change you. Healing is supposed to change you. You cannot go through this deep self-reflection and therapy and journaling and praying and spiritual work and personal growth and still remain the same person. Transformation requires evolution. And evolution sometimes changes who you feel aligned with. And this is where I think that loneliness begins to show up. Because when you start becoming more intentional about your life, you may find yourself stepping away from certain dynamics. You might spend more time in reflection. You might spend more time prioritizing your peace. You might start choosing quality connections over quantity. And that transition period can feel quiet. Sometimes people misinterpret that quiet as isolation, but many times it's actually just a realignment. It's the space between who you used to be and who you're becoming. It's the space where you're learning new habits, new boundaries, new ways of showing up in the world. And during that season, your circle might look different for a while because some people will just fall away. Some people will drift. Some people will remain, but in a different capacity. And new people will eventually start to enter, your life. People who align with the version of you that's emerging. But during that transition, the quiet can feel unfamiliar. That's why it is so important to remember that loneliness and solitude are not the same. Loneliness is like this feeling of disconnection. But solitude can be a powerful part of healing because solitude is where clarity grows. It's where you begin hearing your own voice again, where you reconnect with yourself without all the noise of the outside expectations. It's where you begin to ask yourself questions like, what do I actually want? What kind of life feels peaceful to me? What kind of relationships feel healthy for me? And when you start answering those questions honestly, your life begins to align with those answers. And alignment sometimes requires distance from environments that once felt normal, but no longer feel healthy. So if you are in a season where growth feels a little quiet, if you're in a season where your circle looks a little different, or you're in a season where you're spending, more time with yourself than you used to, I just want you to know that it doesn't mean that something's wrong. It might actually mean that something's working, because healing sometimes pulls you away from the noise, right? So that way you can hear the direction clearly of where your life is meant to go. And the beautiful thing about growth is that even though it can feel lonely for a season, it eventually leads you towards people, environments, and opportunities that align with the version of you that you chose to heal. Right? And so after everything that we've talked about, the silence, the distance, the misunderstandings, the quiet seasons of growth, this is where we get to the good part, right? because we know that healing changes your circle, but it doesn't mean that you walk the journey alone, right? When you go into that season of solitude, you're not exactly by yourself. I think that one of the beautiful things about growth is that it eventually leads you to your people. Not the people who needed you to stay small. Not the people who only felt comfortable around the version of you that never spoke up. Not the people who only showed up when you were convenient to them. I'm talking about the people who respect your evolution. The people who don't feel threatened by your boundaries. The people who don't question your healing. The people who don't require you to shrink in order to belong. See, these are the people who understand that growth is not rejection, that growth is alignment, right? I always say that I gravitate towards people who feel like sunshine. And I think I've shared this story before. I'm growing up in the church. I can remember sitting there, and you guys know I like the pretty stained glass windows in churches. And so if you've sat in the church and, there's all, for me, my experience. Okay. I just remember sitting in church, and when the sun was shining on the stained glass, how it would feel like showering you, like warming your skin. And so those are my I gravitate towards people who put me back in that space. People who feel like sunshine, who feel warm and inviting, right? See, when you find people who are aligned with your healing, like the dynamic just feels different. And maybe it's not sunshine for you. Maybe you have another, emotion or feeling tied to yours. But when you meet those people, you don't feel like you have to constantly explain yourself. You don't feel like you're walking on eggshells. You don't feel like you have to edit your truth just to keep the peace. Instead, you feel something that many of us didn't experience earlier in life. You feel safe, right? Safe to speak honestly, safe to set your boundaries, safe to express your emotions, safe to show up as the version of yourself that healing created. And let me tell you something about safe people, right? My favorite part of safe people is that they don't rush your story. Safe people don't force vulnerability. Safe people don't treat your boundaries like obstacles. They treat them like instructions on how to love you better. Safe people listen. They respect your peace. They respect your pace. They respect your space. And not only do they respect your space, they hold space for your growth without trying to control it. And when you start building relationships like that, something inside of you relaxes. Because for the first time, you're not constantly defending your healing. You're simply living in it. And I want to say something important here, because I think that sometimes when people hear this, they think finding your people means replacing everybody in your life. And that's not always the case. Sometimes the people who were already in your life will grow with you, right? Sometimes they'll grow with you, but that's not always the case. Sometimes the people in your life evolve, right? Sometimes, they adjust to the new version of you, and the relationship becomes healthier than it was in the beginning. But sometimes new connections enter your life that reflect the version that you chose to heal. And those, connections can often feel different in the beginning because they feel lighter, right? More respectful, more reciprocal. You're not the only person giving. You're not the only person listening. You're not the only one showing up for the relationship or the friendship. There's a balance, right? There's understanding. There's space and room for everybody to breathe and grow. And see, when that happens, You start to realize that all this time you were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong people. You know, I don't know. Sometimes we just ask the wrong people. We ask for the right thing. We just ask it from the wrong person. You know, that respect that you needed, the understanding that you hoped for, the support that you deserve. It existed. It just wasn't present in the environments that you were trying to force yourself to grow in. And, you know, healing helps you to recognize that. Healing helps you to recognize where your energy is honored and where it is constantly drained. And once you see the difference, you begin choosing relationships that reflect the life that you're building, not the life that you were surviving. Because the version of you that fought to heal deserves a community, right? A community that supports your peace, not a community that competes with it. So if you've been feeling like your circle is shifting, if you've been feeling like your connections are changing, or if you've been wondering whether you'll ever find people who truly understand your journey, I just want to reassure you that your people exist. And the more aligned you become with your healing, the easier it becomes to, you know, for the right people to recognize you. But nonetheless, your healing is still valid. And before we close out today's conversation, I do just want to slow down and speak directly to the person who might still be wrestling with this idea of exulansis, right? Let's get back to the root of the word or the conversation, which is the word exulansis. Sometimes the hardest part of healing is not the work itself. It's the doubt that creeps in when other people question your growth. How do I want to say this? It's when people don't understand why you've changed, right? When they question your boundaries, when they treat your healing like it's something that you need to justify, because that kind of, reaction can make you second guess yourself. You might start asking things like, am I being too hard on people? Am I overreacting? Or am I pushing people away? And if we're honest, most of us have had those moments where we've almost talked ourselves out of our own healing just to make other people comfortable. You've probably had those moments where you thought about reopening a door that you closed. Not because it was healthy, but because the discomfort of somebody misunderstanding you felt heavy. You've probably had moments where you wondered if maybe you were being too strict with your boundaries. Maybe you questioned whether protecting your peace was worth the distance that it was creating. Whatever it is, I just want to say something that might help you breathe a little easier right now. Your healing is still valid, even if people don't understand it. Your growth does not require a unanimous approval. Your boundaries do not require a group vote. Your peace does not require permission. The truth is, people often struggle to understand healing because healing disrupts their familiar patterns. When you change your responses, when you stop tolerating things that you once accepted, when you start prioritizing your emotional and mental well-being, it forces other people to adjust. Welcome in, Coach Sherelle. Not everybody is comfortable with the adjustment, because we know that some people just prefer the version of you that they were used to, that version that was more accessible, more accommodating, more willing to sacrifice your needs for the sake of keeping things running smoothly. But we also know that healing changes that dynamic. Healing teaches you to check in with yourself before you automatically say yes. Healing teaches you that protecting your peace is not selfish, it is a necessity. Healing teaches you that your time, your energy, and your emotional availability are valuable resources. And once you understand that, you begin making different choices. Some of those choices involve distance. Sometimes it involves difficult conversations or closing doors that once felt impossible to close. But none of those decisions invalidate your healing. In fact, many of them are evidence of it, because we know that growth is not always comfortable. It's not always understood, and it's not always applauded. Right? We know that growth is sometimes quiet. It is often misunderstood. Sometimes growth just looks like walking away from something that you once begged to keep. And if you're in that season right now, I just want you to remember that healing is not about convincing everyone else that you're right. Healing is about becoming honest with yourself, honest about what you need, honest about what hurts you, honest about the kind of life that you want to build moving forward. And when you start living from that place of honesty, your life begins aligning with your truth, even if other people don't understand it. So if people question your boundaries, if they misunderstand your growth, if they can't quite grasp why you've changed, let them have their perspective. You don't have to carry the burden of, making your healing make sense to everyone else. Some journeys are simply too personal to be explained in a way that everyone will understand, and that's okay. Because the most important person who needs to understand your healing is you. And the fact that you chose to grow, to reflect, to evolve and heal, despite everything that you've been through, is the proof alone of your strength. Your healing is real. Your peace is earned. And the version of you that you fought to become, that version of you who you are today, deserves to be honored. And so as we get ready to close out today's conversation, I just want to bring us right back to the word that started it. Exulansis. That quiet moment when you realize some expectations are too deep, too personal, too layered for certain people to fully understand. And instead of exhausting yourself trying to translate your healing into a language that everybody approves of, you simply stop explaining. Not because your story isn't worth telling, but because you've realized that your healing does not require a universal understanding to be valid. Today, we talked about what that looks like in real life. We talked about how people often only meet the healed version of you, but never saw the breakdown that created it. We talked about the cost of becoming the version of yourself that honors your peace. We talked about the silence that sometimes follows healing, not as a weakness, but as wisdom. We talked about the reality that validation doesn't always come from the people we expected it to come from. We talked about the loneliness that sometimes shows up during seasons of growth. And we talked about the beautiful truth that when you continue honoring your healing, you eventually find the people who recognize it and respect it and support it. But more than anything, I just hope that today reminded you that healing is not a performance. You are not required to explain your growth to everyone who questions it. You are not required to reopen doors that your healing helped you to close. You are not required to shrink your peace just to make other people comfortable. Sometimes the most powerful thing that you can do is simply continue to become the version of yourself that chose to heal in the first place. Because the truth is, the people who care about you will eventually notice the difference. They're going to notice the boundaries. They're going to notice, the peace in your energy. They'll notice the clarity in how you move through life now. And the right people won't ask you to return to who you used to be. They will simply show up and respect who you've become. So if you've been carrying this weight of feeling misunderstood, if you've been wondering whether or not your growth is worth the distance it sometimes creates, I hope that today is your reminder that the version of you that fought to heal deserves to exist without apology. Your boundaries are valid. Your peace is valuable. And the life that you're building, the one that's rooted in clarity and self-respect and emotional honesty, is worth protecting. Family, if today's conversation spoke to your spirit, go ahead and drop some green hearts in the chat. Those little green hearts are our way of saying that I'm healing, I am growing, and I am showing up for me. And if you know someone who might need to hear this conversation today, someone who may be struggling with feeling misunderstood in their healing journey, share this episode with them. Because sometimes the greatest gift that we can give someone is a reminder that they're not alone in what they are feeling. Focus Mental Health, welcome in. Thank you so much. Now, before we go, please remember that some people will never fully understand your healing because they never saw what it took you to survive. But that does not make your healing any less real. As we close out, I just want you to know that I am here to encourage you to keep breathing. As Loudon, welcome in. I want you to keep breathing through the highs, the lows, and every moment in between. I want you to keep choosing peace, even if it feels out of reach. Hey, Jessica. And know that here in the Room to Breathe community and the Self-Care Club, you will always be seen, always valued, and always supported. So don't be afraid to take up space, speak your truth, and make a little room for you to breathe. I love each and every one of you to life. And I am praying that your day is not just amazing, but aligned, intentional, and yes, on purpose, filled with purpose. This has been another Room to Breathe podcast, and I cannot wait to connect with you all again.
Me, I found my